Dear colleagues, welcome to our 12th International Conference for Teachers of English Language Teaching during COVID-19. I hope you've enjoyed our sessions so far. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce one of our guest speakers, Dr. Erika Saito. Dr. Erika Saito is an assistant professor and course lead in the Masters in Social and Emotional Learning, SEL, and Masters in Education with an SEL and emphasis at National University Sanford College of Education. She teaches research in SEL and SEL action research methods for educators. Prior to National University, Dr. Saito taught in Pepperdine University's MA TESOL program and teacher credentialing candidates in teaching English learners. Dr. Saito's background includes over 15 years as a pre-K through 12 classroom teacher, literacy teacher on special assignment, and ELD sheltered programs department chair in both public and private institutions in Southern California. Dr. Saito's research is published in Teachers College Record, School Community Journal, the Family Journal, and Berkeley Review of Education. She is currently K-12 level chair for COTESOL, secretary-elect for areas SEL Special Interest Group, associate editor for Journal of Interdisciplinary Studies in Education, and article editor for Issues in Teacher Education. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Erika Saito.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and also for David for hosting this today. And I know that so many of us, especially yesterday in our sessions, talked about this living in a state of unknowns, not knowing if we're going to stay remote, as some of us have, not knowing if we're currently in person and we'll move back to remote due to the new variants that are coming out. And so it's been helpful for me to reflect upon these past 2 years, and especially in the ways that we've transformed education during COVID. And it's also brought forth this need. So one that was always a concern, even before COVID, and that is the area of social emotional learning. The field of social emotional learning, or SEL, as it's also called, has been around for about 3 decades. And it took COVID to bring this area to the forefront of our education. I also want to preface this presentation by saying that this is not exclusive in the ESOL context. It's inclusive of every classroom and even adults, right, as we're all trying to navigate this process. So today we'll be looking at this broader landscape of SEL in education, and it is a repeated presentation from yesterday, so it's the same information. But before we begin, I wanted to thank the conference committee and the National Pedagogic University Francisco Morazan and the U.S. Department of State for allowing me to be here today. I'm truly grateful for this opportunity, and I hope the information that I'm sharing with all of you today can somehow be applied into your classrooms or in your life. So going back to what I just mentioned a minute ago regarding social emotional learning needs during COVID, I wanted to start this presentation by introducing you to a warm welcome and creating a brave space for discussion. This will also lead into my attempt to define this broad term of social emotional learning, as you'll see, through larger known SEL frameworks, and also understanding the SEL context. We'll then move into SEL and application during the pandemic, what adults can do to navigate their emotions during this challenging time, and how it can be promoted within our classrooms. And at the end, I'd like to also leave with an optimistic closure. So beginning and ending the day with something positive. So I'm curious to know how you're feeling at this exact moment. So this is called a temperature check. If you could rate your feelings on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being happy and calm, and 5 being furious, angry, enraged, what number or word describes you? So feel free to drop the number, the word, or the emoji into the chat. So as I mentioned, this scale is called a temperature check, and it's used to quickly gauge students' emotions as they enter the classroom or online space. Oftentimes, we don't ask each student how they're feeling every single day, or we wait until the end of the school day to ask questions about how they're feeling or why they misbehaved during class. And by then, it might be too late. By waiting until the end of the day, it's already led to misbehavior or disengagement. But if we address it first, it can be used as a preventative measure. So this is an image of something that I just created. I just used tables, colors, emojis, numbers, words, and it can be used with students and even teachers. You can find other examples similar to this one online, and it can also be adapted for online instruction, put on a slide just like this. Students can just write the number to express how they're feeling at that moment. They could type in the word emoji, like I said, in the chat box, and you can decide whether you want it sent publicly or privately. And this way, students are able to self-identify the feelings, and they're being acknowledged for having these feelings. This supports their self-awareness. So again, this is something quick, it's easy, it should be done daily, and it's very easy to implement into your classroom. And I'll share a few variations of the same practice. For in-person instruction, it can be printed, it can be posted on a wall, you can use sticky notes on it, you can use student photos as they check in. It could be a small slip of paper where they just write their name and a number. So these are really quick check-ins of how they're feeling. It could be expanded upon too. So you could turn these into sentences. It can be turned into like a journal prompt. And then these vocabulary words can also change as students progress throughout the year. Here are some other ways that you can begin a class with a warm welcome. The image here on the right is a mood meter developed by Mark Brackett, and his work looks at widening one's emotional vocabulary. This is great for all students, for everybody, because you can attach these more accurate terms to the emotions you're feeling based on the levels of pleasantness, which are at the bottom, and then the levels of energy, just over here on the right side. It's also color-coded to make it easier to identify the words to match their feelings. I've had teachers take this and adapt it into other languages to widen their students' vocabulary. And using the mood meter, and I don't know if you could see the words or not, I'm not sure how big it is, are there more accurate words that describe how you're feeling right now? So as opposed to the temperature check where you have the scale 1 to 5, now it's like an explosion of words where you just have so many words that can more accurately describe how you're feeling. So right now I would say I'm somewhere at ease. I feel and pleasant. I'm really happy to be here right now. But all of these check-ins allow students to name the feeling, expand their emotional vocabulary, and I think this can also be adapted too. So you don't have to suddenly show this entire picture of with all of these words. It can be introduced slowly. Another thing that you could do as a check-in, and when I'm talking about check-ins, it's the beginning of class, the beginning of the day, right? Is the Google form, or I know Word also has their version of forms, and that's a digital version of a check-in, and it works really well when you're teaching remotely. So outside of these daily check-ins are these year-long community building supports that help foster positive classroom climates. Morning meetings are sometimes referred to as a community meeting or class meeting that starts at the beginning of the day or class, depending on what level you're teaching, where the teacher holds a discussion on topics tied to SEL. So this could include a thematic topic, such as a word of the week, or SEL related phrases and words, and you can expand upon them. You can read stories and have students connect to the characters in the stories that are tied to these words, connect to students' lives, and then actually see how they're applying these words, their behaviors, into the classroom. A morning meeting can be something that is very brief, but it should be done consistently throughout the year. And these promote self and social awareness, as well as relationship building. So beginning each day with a warm welcome, I really strongly encourage it. It's something that you can easily apply, but it builds and promotes healthy relationships. It builds upon their social emotional skills and all of these competencies that you'll see in a few minutes. Another area that I'd like to introduce is creating a brave space. When we're creating a space for critical dialogue, particularly in our classrooms, and especially in an online space, it's very important to discuss brave spaces. In social justice work, the term brave space was described in Brian Ario and Christy Clemens' chapter, From Safe to Brave Spaces. Establishing these ground rules collectively with your students is important prior to holding a class discussion or other types of critical dialogue. So here are the recommendations in facilitating a brave space. One is controversy with civility. This means that participants can engage in conversation, and it can include disagreements. But you should identify the source of the issue and possible solutions or ways to come to a resolution. I would strongly recommend and say that I would avoid, this makes sense, saying the phrase, I agree to disagree. When we make statements like this, we are reinforcing one's dominance over the rest of the group, and it stops or ends the conversation without a further discussion. Number 2 is owning intentions and impact. This refers to the things that are said or intended to mean, but they sometimes don't always align with the impact, and this could tie into like a miscommunication. Challenge by choice means it's up to the individual to decide the level of participation one engages in, and whether or not they want to participate at all. So I know in a language classroom, we always want participation. We constantly want people to engage like 100% of the time, right? And that's always encouraged. But when we're talking about sensitive topics, when it's very personal, we have to be supportive of our students, especially their emotional well-being. So if we're forcing a student to express how they're feeling in front of an entire group, we could be traumatizing them or re-traumatizing them. It could trigger something else, and it would make the situation worse. So know that it's choice, that it's a student's choice to participate in a critical dialogue. And also being respectful and being respected. I know that people always think of this, they know these things, but sometimes we're not aware of these cultural nuances of what respect looks like and what it sounds like. And last but not least, just no attacks, right? No one wants to be attacked. No one wants to be disrespected. And instead, hold a clarifying conversation. So I've actually engaged in some of these practices with people that I trust and know. And I come to find that once you communicate, once you really have a good discussion, even though it might be difficult, you come out feeling better about everything because you understand why they said what they said. You find the root of the problem, and I think that's really important. So as we started opening up this forum space and setting some expectations of how we're approaching this conversation, I will finally start presenting on this topic of what is social emotional learning. So it's a really big term. There are so many other terms that are attached to social emotional learning. It's also referred to as SEL. And depending on the context, it's called emotional intelligence, non-cognitive skills, developmental assets, character skills, 21st century skills, interpersonal skills, among others. But ultimately, social and emotional learning is centered on emotional development. And while there is no single definition out there that encapsulate all of what SEL is and what it does, I am defining SEL as this human developmental process that begins in infancy and continues throughout one's life. And you will hear me repeat this point throughout this presentation. As we encounter a range of adverse situations, our response to these situations changes, right? Depends on context. SEL is also tied to our relationships, the way we manage our emotions, and how we identify ethnically, spiritually, age, gender, race, profession, all of the above. So SEL is a broad term, and it's applied to everything we do and think, even at a subconscious level. And right now, some states in the US, SEL is a requirement. It's a requirement of part of their teaching practice. There are standards that are aligned with K-12 schools. So a lot of this has actually come out recently, mostly during COVID, but we're seeing it as more of this normalized expectation within schools. So why does SEL matter? Well, SEL is an important aspect of our overall well-being. Social and emotional development, as mentioned earlier, goes throughout our lives, and it's largely shaped by our experiences and how we respond to them. So in a broader sense, incorporation of explicitly teaching SEL in your classroom or an organizational setting is perceived as a preventative measure to assist us when we're facing adverse situations. Having social emotional skills leads to positive social adjustment and well-being, which in a school setting also positively impacts academic achievement. And SEL includes building these relations, the relationships that students have with other students, students have with adults, and between adults. These relations extend into areas of empathy, understanding and respecting others' cultures. And a greater piece of this, I believe, is the area of self-awareness. We are all experiencing the challenges of our society, whether it's tied to racial justice, COVID-19, or other areas that have impacted our lives. SEL helps in this process of facing our societal realities, and this in turn promotes our resilience in facing these situations. In the US, the most commonly referred SEL framework is CASEL's framework. And CASEL stands for Collaborative for Academics in Social and Emotional Learning. This framework and the term SEL were coined about 30 years ago by CASEL researchers, and it has recently been revised in its settings, which are these outer rings or the settings. The framework is a K-12 school-centered framework that focuses primarily on SEL competencies developed in classrooms and schools. The 4 key settings are where SEL takes place and develops. This includes where SEL can be and should be explicitly taught and modeled, the school, which includes school-wide culture, practices, and policies. And between these 2 settings, it's important to consider whether SEL is happening just in one class or an entire school. I believe it should be implemented school-wide. And having that congruency between classroom and school would be ideal to promote social emotional development. The other key settings with families, caregivers, and communities are present, but in a lot of the social emotional work, it's seen as a partnered setting rather than aligned to leverage and promote SEL. And I think that's one area that we can continue to develop. And so here are the 5 competencies, the components that are in the middle. And these competencies are focused in classrooms and schools for SEL development. The emphasis of CASEL competencies focuses on interpersonal skills. And I've embedded some of these terms here on the right, and also in discussing some of the previous slides, and transformed some of the definitions, especially with my own personal belief in social justice and our decision-making process. So on the right-hand side, when we think about self-awareness, it is about developing our own self-identity. It's also engaging in our own awareness of who we are and why we are this way. With self-management, I think it moves beyond just managing our own behaviors. I think it's examining our own biases as well. And it also informs some of our decisions. So when we think about decision making, I believe that it should also be informed and socially just. So we're not just thinking in our heads of what a decision looks like. We're also gathering the correct information before we make these decisions or assumptions. And then with relationship skills, as well as social awareness, it should move beyond just our own comfort zones. I believe that relationships should extend beyond, our own little friend groups that we've grown up with and become more diverse, explore other cultures, other places. And with social awareness, it's looking not just at the physical environment that you're in, but also addressing some of the societal issues, societal realities. And this kind of goes along with a chapter that I co-authored that's called Creating Brave Spaces in Social Justice and Social Emotional Learning in Language Learner Classrooms. So now that I've just mentioned CASTLE's framework, which has the 5 competencies and the 4 key settings, CASTLE's framework is, again, largely centered in K-12. And I wanted to take a moment to briefly introduce a few other social and emotional frameworks, okay, that include adult development, and they're not limited to school settings. So the first is the Clover Model, which is characterized by these 4 domains to kind of almost look like a clover, but it doesn't in this image, to represent the human developmental process beginning in infancy and continuing into adulthood. It's sometimes referred to as the developmental process theory, and there are 4 distinct domains that are attributed to 4 developmental periods. So early childhood, middle childhood, early adolescence, and late adolescence. Active engagement is a specialized area within early childhood that continues throughout development, right, their whole developmental process. And it's defined by this physical connection to the world around them. And this can include understanding our bodies, being able to move around. And as they progress through the human developmental stages, it may turn into other physical activities like playtime and sports and acting. Assertiveness is specialized in middle childhood, and it's defined as having agency. It's negotiating with oneself and others and decision making. So these transition into developing one's voice, position, expressing opinions and beliefs, and we can support our students in this age and stage by giving them choices, by making them feel more independent and allowing them to make decisions in the classroom. Belonging is a specialization in early adolescence, and it's tied to relationship building with peers and adults, groups, and their own identity. In a classroom, this could be supported by working in pairs, working in groups, and creating connections by being involved with clubs, participating in class, volunteering. And then reflection is a specialization in late adolescence, and it's defined as creating and making sense of one's experiences, decisions, and identity. So this can be supported in the classroom through structured time that allows for reflection and can easily be done through journaling. So think about opportunities that you can use to develop this in your classroom. And so while there is this focus that's described within these time periods, these 4 domains continuously overlap and change over time. So what makes this model a little bit different is that it does not rely on a curriculum or in-school instruction, but it aligns more with just the natural human development and social emotional development. So while there are these numerous frameworks and programs that are out there, the bulk of these programs and frameworks, again, are centered within these K-12 spaces. And for those that have adult SEL frameworks, they're usually combined. They're combined with other grade levels, especially in more recent frameworks. And they're also combined with colleges and career readiness. So these 2 frameworks are also, they also include SEL. One is the Big 5 personality traits, also known as the 5-factor model or Ocean model. And it centers on emotions and personality dimensions and behaviors. So these are adjectives that were identified by personality psychologists to describe the personality dimensions that align with health, educational outcomes, and careers. And this has been around for several decades, and it hasn't really changed over time. To the right is something that's more recent like in the past 5 years, as opposed to several decades, right? So ACT is most widely known, and you've probably heard of ACT, for their standardized college entrance exams. And about 5-6 years ago, they came into this SEL field with the ACT Holistic Framework of Education and Work Readiness. So this framework extends from early childhood through adulthood. And this was created due to the changing demands of college entrance requirements and understanding the ways colleges prepare students for their careers. For example, they have cross-cutting capabilities. In this also ranges from technological literacy to problem solving, behavioral skills. It includes things like managing stress and working well with others. So education and career navigation skills is also having the knowledge to understand the majors that they're taking, the career paths, and then making the appropriate decisions to follow that correct career path. So again, something more recent. So it's interesting to see how our education is really transforming, where it's not just focused on math and language arts or English. We're now looking at these other areas, and even these testing services that are huge in the US are also changing with the times. So now that I've provided an overview to some existing SEL frameworks, you can find some connections across all of them, in spite of the different settings and the different target ages. But when you're looking at how to apply an SEL framework internationally, it's important to understand the ranging definitions and how these competencies are translated within each country's context and culture. Consideration of the intended populations should serve as a starting point in defining the components of SEL that align with the cultural norms before placing it into application. So think about whether the ages and stages of human development, like you saw in the Clover model, does it align with the cultural human development ages and stages? Further consideration is also the outcome. What do you value? Do you place an emphasis more on well-being or academic success? Other pieces to consider when you're choosing an SEL framework for your school site or for your classroom is that it's not something that I can come in and enforce upon you. So I cannot tell you what framework to use. I can't tell you you have to do this, because I don't understand your classroom community. Only you do, right? As educators, we're pulling from our own understandings, our own experiences, our lived experiences, right? Within our community context. So we need to ask ourselves, who are the students in my classroom and what best represents my students' community? What do I understand as a need to help develop them into responsible citizens? So something that I might identify within my classroom might be very different, right? It could be something as simple as sharing. My students don't know how to share because we've been online. And now that we're in person, we're not supposed to share. But I still want them to understand this concept of sharing. So it's something like that. Like, that's my personal context. It might look different in yours. What do I understand as a need? And what are my cultural beliefs and values that I can build upon and connect to what already exists? So I can't tell you what you already have access to, what practices are already in place, and what can be built upon, right? That's up to you to decide. And how are the terms being used and understood by my students? Is there any clarification needed in the way it is used or internalized? Then there's the side of instructional practices. So as English educators, it's important for us to understand the varying cultures and backgrounds that we serve. How are we aligning our instructional practices in SEL to also reflect and honor our students' cultures? How are we engaging and acknowledging the backgrounds of our students in the classroom to develop their SEL competencies? So much of this stems from us as educators being in touch with societal realities, with knowing and being comfortable with ourselves, and embodying these SEL qualities, engaging critical self-reflection, addressing our own biases and assumptions of our students. And all of this is to continuously improve ourselves, our profession, and our SEL practice. So an ideal framework for adult SEL, and this is just me talking right now, I think it should be inclusive of culture, inclusive of one's setting, one's environment, as I mentioned before. And it should include things like our workplace, our home, or other spaces where we interact. The current role of adults in SEL, and I know I mentioned parts of this earlier, it's usually relational. So I mentioned earlier that some are set in school settings, right? So the adult is the college student, or the adult is the responsible person imparting and teaching these SEL competencies. Adults are impacting social emotional development, right, of students in the classroom, in the home, or out of school settings. And further, the previous frameworks I share that do include adults, but it always looks like they have reached the end of their SEL developmental process within these frameworks. So if it's ending in college, which is where these frameworks end, what happens afterwards? Does social emotional development just stop? I don't know, does it? So I can tell you in my personal experience, I don't think so. You know, I'm going through so many different things right now with COVID. There's changing in the way that we're living, in the way that we're teaching. There's so many things have changed, and it's just up to us with how we're adapting to these situations, if we're okay with it, right? And as we know, we are, well, currently, if we're in college or out of college, we're all in these different spaces. And this, again, adult SEL is a less developed field. It's a less developed area. And we can use these frameworks, though, to help guide us in developing something else, right? Something new, transforming this space. So I hope this is helpful for you so far. But I also think it's important to take a step back before we take a step forward. And I think it's important to understand the SEL context pre-COVID. So what did this look like? So here is some information from 2019, so just before COVID. And in 2019, teachers described increased feelings of stress and anxiety from their jobs. And there were also higher rates of attrition. Yet it was also found that teachers who had a grasp of and are able to apply social emotional competencies were connected with increasing rates of teacher retention and also job satisfaction. So teachers with SEL skills are better able to manage their emotions, therefore impacting the interactions that they have with students, and improvement in teacher-student relations. I mean, it makes sense, right? If you have the SEL competencies, you know how to manage your emotions, you're going to have a more positive interaction with your students. The way teachers feel impacts their teaching. So if you're in a bad mood, you come and you show your students you're in a bad mood. Well, the students, they might be turned off by this. They might be disengaged. But the way teachers feel, it impacts the teaching. And as a result, it impacts student learning. Teachers who are better equipped with SEL competencies are positively impacting their students' achievement. So just remember that. Pre-COVID, there were not only these feelings of teacher anxiety, stress, and attrition, but there were also self-reports of their beliefs in improving their students' SEL competencies. However, these teachers also felt that there were factors outside of school that had a greater influence than what they could do in the classroom. So a majority of teachers also felt there was a greater need or pressure to improve achievement versus focusing on SEL. And something they probably didn't know is that developing social emotional learning in the classroom is a factor in raising academic achievement and also decreasing behavioral issues. Pre-COVID, the majority of teachers received SEL professional development, but they also noted that these PDs did not provide ways to adapt SEL into different cultural or linguistic backgrounds, as well as using SEL data. And this is important because we often use data to help guide us, right, with identifying the issues and how we're going to address them. As mentioned in the previous study, teachers' well-being is positively associated with their knowledge of and implementing SEL practices. In spite of teachers serving in communities of varying poverty levels, only small differences were found with teacher well-being in these schools. Also, Elementary teachers reported higher levels of school support for SEL compared to secondary teachers. And there could be a range of factors for this that include less time in the classroom at a secondary level with students and teachers, but also students continue to progress in age and development. And some people just believe that they just don't need to focus on it as much because it should have already been developed. But right now, as adults, we are also experiencing a range of emotions and experience, right? Things that we've never encountered before. We're all trying to navigate the same space, and we're all trying to find support that works for us. So just imagine how students who don't have these different levels of support, what they're going through, right? How they're feeling. And in my other presentation later today, we'll focus on this trauma-informed practices and focusing on this post-pandemic world. COVID-19 has raised issues of educational equity. And I wanted to go over a few points here that will be expanded upon as well in the other presentation. But it's impacted this digital divide, right? As student access to technology. It also impacted instructional practices as so many teachers transitioned without prior online teaching experience or technology training. And this too impacted student learning. Schools were not prioritizing students' needs. Instead, schools made decisions based on what they felt worked best. And this was with regards to program access online and with staffing in an online space. Lastly, COVID for both teachers and students created this more urgent awareness of being isolated, of having limited connections with peers and adults, and the devastation of loved ones. So during COVID, so now we've gone from pre to like during, we'll be talking more of this. During COVID, state education agencies in the US identified SEL as a top priority with a need to address mental health, trauma, and anxiety. So when we're looking at these different percentages with mental health and academics, the priority by state education agencies is overwhelmingly focused on SEL needs. The majority of state education agencies that participated in this study described SEL as an increased priority during COVID, and 78% of state agencies mentioned an increase in district requests for SEL since the start of COVID. So you could see it's a huge need. It's a huge need that hopefully is being served. And this is a quote from Castle, and I feel like this really summarizes one of the major issues. Well, schools are more effective at teaching and reinforcing SEL for students when they also cultivate SEL competencies in adults, right? So it really starts with all of us. It really begins with us. And so now I'll talk a little bit more about adult SEL, and it's an area, as I've said before, not fully explored in research, especially during the pandemic. And if anything, it's been looked through this educational lens of instructional impact on students or the importance of the role of educators, SEL, on student behaviors. But it is a growing area as a result of the pandemic. And I'll say this again and 1,000 times over that I think SEL is this developmental process that we are continuing to face throughout our different life situations. And we are constantly trying to figure out how to manage our emotions when we face these situations. So what we do know is that our students are impacted by us as educators. We affect their social emotional development. And Castle understands this necessity for SEL in adults in order for students to be better equipped in managing their emotions and making responsible decisions. These top priorities and challenges were identified by educators during COVID. The top 3 priorities include addressing mental health needs, including trauma and anxiety. The second is supporting adult SEL and mental health, which means These are teachers, these are parents, these are family members that are all suffering. And the third is providing and supporting professional development on SEL. So educators are not fully equipped to teach SEL, but they want to learn, right? It shows that they want to learn. The top challenges in SEL being a priority are largely based on the issues with limited or lack of training, training staff at school, training district and agency levels were also identified as these top two challenges. The third is a tie between a focus on academics, funding for SEL, and then difficulty with SEL or implementing SEL in distance learning. So these educators are all stating their needs. They want mental health support. They want SEL training, right? And they see these as priorities over their academics. Internationally, COVID has impacted education, as we all know, right? And it's raising this need for social, emotional, and mental health support, and also in the transition back to in-person learning across all countries and socioeconomic levels. And the levels of engagement during this time internationally between teachers and students has really differed based on income levels. And we know this is probably predictable with higher income areas globally have more access to technology, the different modalities to engage students, the different apps that they're using, in connecting with parents, between parents and schools. So this is also something worth noting, right? It's a lot of it is about also access. So what can we do as adults? What can we do to understand and navigate our own social emotional development? And I think this really comes down to self-care. So self-care should not be confused with the term self-indulgence. And self-indulgence is like when you just want something and it has nothing to do with your health. It's more like this feeling of wanting a whole tub of chocolate, and I've had moments like that where I just want to binge eat like chocolates and junk food, but that's not self-care, right? We're looking at healthy habits across a range of different areas. And I'll go into a self-care plan in the next presentation, but it is this reflective process. It's a process where we consider these different categories of your mental self-care, physical, emotional, social, spiritual, and professional. It's good to take time, and I take time for myself every day. And I have 2 kids, I have a job, I have all these things, but I make it a point to give myself time, to give myself space every single day. And I think it's helpful, especially during this time. Another SEL practice that we can engage in as adults is listening. So I know it seems so obvious, right? You're having a conversation, you want to talk to somebody about what's happening, but and maybe that's why it's not so focused within social emotional learning, or it's not as explicitly described. But these learning practices are equitable practices for both adults or educators, students. But for adults, active listening is an important piece of fostering positive relationships and modeling listening practices for our students. So I have a few examples that are here, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them. These require full attention of participants. So in an online space, you'd have to set the ground rules of what that looks like. Maybe it would mean that cameras would be on. Maybe it would mean that your eyes are looking right at the screen, not looking down at your phone or trying to chat to someone else. So no interruptions and no judgment. So the first is constructivist listening, and this provides a space for reflection, releasing emotions, and constructing new meaning about whatever challenges they're facing. This can be used in small groups, and it's recommended to only go up to 5 in a group. It includes times listening without distractions. So each person in a group would speak for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, one person at a time without any interruptions. And I know that's hard to do because a lot of times when I'm listening to someone, I want to respond. Like, I agree. Oh yeah, that happened to me. But in this setting, it's equitable time, equitable attention, no interruptions. And that can be hard to do, but it can be really helpful, especially when you have students who might be shy, or maybe they don't like to talk as much in class, or whatever the reason is. This provides them that space where they can talk, and they will talk for that time. And it's their time, right? Perspectrum is another listening strategy that allows people to state an issue that they're facing. So this is really helpful when someone is facing a problem. One person speaks and they talk about their issue. Everybody else listens and they take notes. Okay, so it's also timed. After the person is finished speaking, each person is timed in the response, the reflection, the feedback that they want to provide or offer. And then active listening is something that you might be more familiar with. It's setting some ground rules too with what you want it to look like. But for me, active listening means that you're engaged with the person that's speaking. You'll ask a clarifying question to show that you're listening. You make a connection to what they're saying. You're reflecting upon what was said. So it's all of these different ways of showing that you're listening. And then there's reflective listening, which is an empathetic move towards acknowledging the speaker's feelings. So if a person is talking about what they're feeling right now, and you want to show empathy towards them, right? The response. One of the key considerations when implementing SEL in an ESL classroom or any classroom is to understand that it does not need to be this purchase program. Okay, you don't need to buy something. There's simple things that you can change in your practices, like a check-in, a temperature check, some sort of warm welcome. And SEL can be implemented through explicit instruction. It could be included across content areas, but it should be done consistent and daily. It should also offer opportunities for students to engage and express their feelings and emotions. Ask students what would help them during this time. And you would be surprised about the types of adjustments and recommendations that they provide, and then think creatively and realistically about how you can adjust them and incorporate them into your practices. And I do want to stress this last piece over here, kernels of practice. Stephanie Jones and Harvard's EASL lab have identified the key areas for a low cost or even no cost, low burden SEL implementation that has been proven to be effective in international settings. So this includes realistic and flexible instructional practices. It could be something simple and easy to add, like one slide. It could be daily journals. It could be sticky notes. It could be a selected text on character development. So these are smaller pieces of implementation that you can add within your practice that supports social emotional development. The second is environment. Does the environment for SEL require or support, or is it achievable independently? Then you also need to think of the supports needed for growth and sustainability. So at this moment, I just wanted to share this. I'm currently working on a qualitative study that looks at international students' perceptions of support during the pandemic. So being in the US, I reached out and posted a survey and also conducted some interviews with students ranging from high school, university, graduate level, and I asked them questions regarding the supports they can identify, both in school and out of school, the ways that they connect with others, and then I also asked them what they felt was missing. So while this may not apply to you or your situation, I always find it helpful to ask students, and that's why in the last slide I mentioned ask students, right? See what they need. So this study was conducted in the spring and summer of 2021, so just this year, and students as a whole wanted more time to just socialize, especially in an online space during school hours. For some students, they returned home, which was overseas during COVID, and they wanted to attend live classes in spite of these major time differences overseas. There was also this issue of support for new students who began the school year during COVID. They struggled to make connections with others because the classes didn't build in time to create relations. So when we think about a high school setting, when you're moving from class to class or Zoom to Zoom, where do they socialize? What happens at that age when you want to make new friends? It's very challenging. And for those that were transitioning to in-person this past spring, some were aware of the mental health or social emotional supports that were available at their institution. Some stated they were not aware of a health center. Some mentioned wanting a space to just relax and connect with others. And so with so many COVID restrictions, many institutions at first prohibited any type of physical connection, right? Or any type of gathering communal space. So thinking about the ways to physically connect is still an issue. When thinking about your own school, are there resources you feel that you can benefit from if your institution provided them? What resources would help you during this time? So just leaving you with something like that. But as we come towards the end of this presentation, I also wanted to end with another strategy, which is something to leave on a positive note, an optimistic closure. So at the end of each class or each school day, we need to take that initiative to end with something positive. It can be a space to reflect upon what was learned. It can be something where we connect something that happened to our personal experiences. And then also think about moving forward and planning our next steps. So if you can, in one word, drop into the chat something that you're feeling at this exact moment or something that you have learned. And then building off of this, think about what you've learned today and what you can realistically apply in the near future. Write this down on a sticky note, and I always keep some right next to me, and post it someplace visible. Here are my references. Thank you again so much for your time. I appreciate this opportunity, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Here is my email. I'm on Twitter. I'm not too active, but sort of active, and my LinkedIn as well. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Saito. It was a very interesting presentation. We don't have any questions, but we have some comments in the chat. I'm going to read some so that you can hear what they have to say. Carlos Torres says, excellent presentation. All of us have faced COVID-19 impacts at different levels. Nonetheless, we continue teaching the best we can.
Yes.
And he encourages us to keep going.
Yes,
and,
keep going, yes.
Yeah, we have some other good comments. Excellent topic. We're learning a lot from Dr. Saito. Really nice presentation. So we have just great comments.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And again, feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I do have resources that I'm willing to share. So in case anyone is, trying to think and figuring out how to incorporate these into the class, I would be happy to help and share. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we encourage you to continue with us, right, in the following presentations. We have one more presentation today from Dr. Saito at 3 p.m. So we'll see you there. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.